June 28th, 2004. Newberry Springs, California. After living in California for 6 months, 30-year-old April Pitzer makes plans to return to her home state of Arkansas to live with her mother, but before she can make the trip, she vanishes without explanation. Shortly before she went missing, April had crossed paths with the wife of a man who had gone to prison years earlier after she testified as an informant in a federal drug case, leading April to fear that her life might be in danger. A year and a half later, some of April's personal belongings are found scattered in a remote mining area of the Mojave Desert, but even though a number of mine shafts are searched and some local residents are looked at as potential suspects, no trace of April is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and this week we're going to be exploring a missing persons case which was featured on Disappeared, the 2004 disappearance of April Pitzer. This is the incredibly sad story of a woman whose life seemed to go on a downward spiral after she was asked to testify as an informant in a major federal drug case in which over 30 people went to prison. When April got divorced from her husband and lost custody of her 2 children, some acquaintances convinced her to relocate from Texas to a remote area of San Bernardino County, California, located in the Mojave Desert. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a very rough community which was rampant with drugs and criminal activity, and over a 6-month period, April pretty much hit rock bottom and decided that she was going to return to her home state of Arkansas to live with her mother, Gloria Denton. But before this could take place, April wound up crossing paths with the wife of one of the men she had helped send to prison in the aforementioned drug case, which made April paranoid that her life might be in danger and she would vanish from the area only 1 week later. Some of April's belongings would eventually be found in the desert in a remote mining area, leading to speculation that she was murdered and dumped in a mine shaft, but her remains have never been found, and while a number of local residents have popped up on the radar as potential suspects, no one has ever been conclusively implicated. Over the past 2 decades, Gloria Denton has worked tirelessly to try to turn up answers about what happened to her daughter and heard a number of rumors and disturbing stories, but the big issue is that a number of the individuals who were suspected of being involved in April's disappearance have since died and possibly taken these answers to their graves. The Disappeared episode about April's case, which was titled Mojave Mystery, has also turned out to be one of the more controversial ones the show ever produced, as it featured interviews with at least 2 individuals who portrayed themselves as being friends of April's, when in actuality, they may have been complicit in her disappearance, or at the very least, knew a lot more than they were letting on. 9 years ago, Gloria was interviewed on an episode of the true crime podcast Unfound, in order to share her version of events, so as we go along, I'll discuss how the media's portrayal of certain aspects of the story may be different than the actual reality, and has caused what was already a very complicated case to become even harder to figure out. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page now has 100 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of April Pitzer. Our story begins in 2004, and our central figure is 30-year-old April Beth Pitzer. April was born in Arkansas to her mother, Gloria Denton, who was only 19 years old at the time. For this reason, April was raised by other relatives throughout her childhood, but still continued to maintain a relationship with Gloria until she decided to move in with her at the age of 17. 5 years later, Gloria relocated to Longview, Texas, while April elected to remain behind in Arkansas, but she ran into legal trouble when she befriended a pair of young women in a bar one night and offered them a ride home until she wound up getting pulled over for driving under the influence. April's situation was worsened by the fact that her two passengers happened to have methamphetamine in their possession, so the police elected to make a deal with April in which they would drop the DUI charge and allow her to avoid jail time if she would function as a drug informant for them. April agreed to the deal, and she wound up infiltrating a local methamphetamine ring, but things reached the point where the police feared that April's safety had been compromised, so they advised her to leave the state, and she moved to Fort Worth, Texas. It was here that April got married to a man named Chase Pitzer and became pregnant with her first child, but in 1998, while she was 8 months along in her pregnancy, the Drug Enforcement Administration suddenly showed up at her door and told her that due to her past work as an informant, she now had to return to Arkansas in order to testify at an upcoming federal trial. It turned out that the drug ring that April had infiltrated was a pretty large one which extended from Arkansas to California, and even though April was reluctant to take the stand as a witness and testify, she ultimately went through with it, and a total of 32 people wound up being convicted and sent to prison on various charges. April returned to Fort Worth to resume her marriage with Chase, and after giving birth to their first daughter, the couple had a second daughter 2 years later. However, the stress of having testified as a drug informant, as well as the combination of postpartum depression, seemed to change April's entire personality. She was constantly paranoid that her life was in danger, and would not even let her daughter sleep in their bedroom alone, for fear that someone might attempt to kidnap or kill them as retribution for her testimony against the drug ring. April also started to drink heavily and do drugs, and this took a major toll on her marriage with Chase. Another major turning point was when April was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and prescribed medication for it. However, Gloria has alleged that it was a misdiagnosis and led to April taking medication that she shouldn't have, which had a further negative effect on her personality. Gloria stated during an interview, quote, "She was just zombified. She felt like she had gone crazy. It just wasn't April," end quote. April and Chase eventually got divorced, and she moved into an apartment with her two daughters, but since April stopped taking her bipolar medication and her behavior became more erratic, a review of the living situation by Child Protective Services concluded that April was unfit to take care of her children, so the two girls were removed from her custody and remanded to the care of Chase's family. April was left devastated by the situation and started hanging out with a new crowd, and this is where she crossed paths with a man named John Lopez, a truck driver from Barstow, California, who was staying with relatives in Texas. Barstow is located in San Bernardino County in the Mojave Desert alongside Interstate 15 and had a population of around 21,000 at that time, but while it's surrounded by some other small towns and unincorporated communities, it's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Now, if you watch the Disappeared episode about this case, you'll see that John Lopez was interviewed and talked about how he and April had started dating, and since he was planning to leave Texas, he convinced her to accompany him back to California. April felt that her absence would cause her ex-husband and daughters to miss her, so Chase would be compelled to take her back, so she agreed to travel to Barstow with John in December of 2003. During his Disappeared interview, John did what he could to come across as a nice, caring guy, and talks about how when they arrived in Barstow, he tried to warn April about the illegal activity and shady characters who pervaded the town, as many of the local residents had criminal records. But in spite of John's attempts to protect her, April decided to move in with Mike Brunell, another man from the area who was known for being involved in drugs, and she relocated to the unincorporated community of Newberry Springs, located about 20 miles east of Barstow. Well, during Gloria's interview on the Unfound podcast, she revealed that John was actually married at the time and had a criminal record for such offenses as car theft. Gloria also shared that John and his wife were con artists and just as shady as the other characters that John had supposedly tried to warn April about. Gloria alleged that John and his wife only used April to drive a stolen Jeep from Texas to Barstow, and they essentially abandoned April a short time after they arrived, which is what prompted April to move in with Mike Brunell. The story goes that he kicked her out at some point, so April was stranded in the area since she had no transportation. Over the next 4 months, April stayed in touch with her mother over the phone and told her that everything was going fine, but during a call which took place on April the 22nd, 2004, April finally told Gloria just how bad her situation had become. According to April, she had pretty much become homeless and had spent the past few months living a day-to-day existence where she bounced around and temporarily stayed in various people's residences in the area. She had pretty much hit rock bottom and was walking down the highway one day when a man named Mark Killebrew pulled over and offered to help her. After she shared her tearful story with Mark, he offered her a job as a caregiver for his elderly invalid mother, Barbara Killebrew, and April would be allowed to stay at her residence in Newberry Springs. April said that after caring for her for a while, Barbara convinced her to phone her mother to tell her the full truth about her situation. April told Gloria that she was finally getting back on her feet, and she had split her time living with Barbara and some other local residents, including a man named Steve Wilkinson, who lived in the nearby unincorporated community of Daggett. Much like John Lopez, Wilkinson was interviewed on the Disappeared episode and presented himself as being a friend of April's who had served time in prison for drug offenses in the past, but acted like he was now reformed. Well, it turned out that Steve Wilkinson was probably the sketchiest character in this whole story, but we'll talk more about him in a little while. Well, on June the 22nd of that year, April spoke on the phone with Gloria again and was quite concerned because she had just attended a party being held by Wilkinson and happened to cross paths with a woman named Brandy Brooks, the wife of one of the drug dealers that April had helped put in prison when she testified as an informant at the federal drug trial years earlier. This man wound up serving 7 years in prison, and the story later provided by Wilkinson is that April overreacted when she saw Brandy as she attempted to apologize to her and may have wound up revealing too much information about her past as a drug informant. April felt that her life might be in danger over this, so Gloria offered to wire some money to purchase a bus ticket so she could immediately leave the area. However, Gloria was in the midst of preparing to move from Longview, Texas to Clarksdale, Arkansas, so April wanted to hold off on joining her there until Gloria was settled in to her new residence. When Gloria asked April if she had a safe place to stay until then, April replied, quote, "Uncle Chuck." This was in reference to a 52-year-old resident named Chuck Hollister who lived on Caspian Way in Newberry Springs and had earned his Uncle Chuck nickname because he was known for taking people into his house who were down on their luck. April had stayed with Chuck in the past, and she assured her mother that she would remain at his place until Gloria moved into her new residence in Clarksville. She also provided Chuck's phone number to Gloria so she could call her to let her know when she was settled, and they would both arrange to wire April money for her bus ticket to come home. Well, Gloria soon completed her move to Clarksville, but nearly 2 weeks passed without her hearing from April. Since April did not have her own cell phone, Gloria kept trying to call Chuck Hollister's residence to reach her, but no one answered. On July the 4th, Gloria received a call from Barbara Killebrew, the elderly invalid woman whom April had been caring for. Barbara wanted to check if April had settled into her new home, only for Gloria to inform her that April had never arrived in Clarksville and she was unable to reach her. Barbara claimed that she last saw April on June the 26th, as Chuck had brought her to her residence in order to collect her belongings and say goodbye. Barbara never saw April again, as she spent the next week in the hospital and then called Gloria when she returned home because she assumed April would be there. Gloria became concerned enough to contact the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department and attempted to report April missing, but they told her that they could only accept missing persons reports from local residents and also said that since April was an adult, she had the legal right to disappear voluntarily if she wanted to. For the next 12 days, Gloria did not hear from April and could not get in touch with her or Chuck Hollister, so on July the 16th, she called Barbara and asked her to report April missing on her behalf, and this time, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department finally agreed to take the report and launch an investigation. On July the 20th, Gloria finally received a phone call back from Chuck, who told her that he had been out of town for the last several weeks because he traveled to Oregon to help a friend move. According to Gloria, Chuck said he had been planning to drive April to the bus station whenever she was ready to make her trip to Clarksville, and last saw her sleeping when he left his house on the morning of June the 28th. But when he returned home later that day, April was gone, so he just assumed that someone else had given her a ride to the bus station and she went back home to Arkansas. However, Chuck also told Gloria that April had left some of her personal belongings behind, including her white suitcase and her backpack, and they were still at his residence. Since April had never contacted her mother about wiring her money for a bus ticket, Gloria feared that something bad had happened to her. For the next month and a half, a number of missing persons flyers for April were posted and circulated throughout the area, but on September the 9th, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department received a promising lead when they were contacted by an employee at a bus station in Barstow. The employee reported that a woman had noticed April's photo on a missing persons poster and made a comment that she was, quote-unquote, in a hole. The woman was eventually tracked down and questioned about this, but while she denied having any direct knowledge of April's disappearance, she said that she had heard rumors at a party that April was dead and her body had been dumped in a mine shaft, though she claimed she could not specifically remember who told her this. While the Mojave Desert was replete with abandoned mines, the issue was that there were over 20,000 of them in San Bernardino County alone, so it would have been impossible to search all of them. Another promising lead surfaced during this time period, as a message was found scrawled on the wall of the men's room at a Love's truck stop in Roseburg, Oregon, over 800 miles away, and it read, quote, "Want to find a missing girl from Arkansas, I-15, 3 miles east of Barstow," end quote. Naturally, this raised suspicion that the aforementioned missing girl may have been April, so investigators collected the surveillance footage from a security camera which overlooked the entrance to the men's room at this truck stop and showed every person who went inside during the time period the graffiti was believed to have been written. But there did not appear to be anyone in the footage who had a personal connection to April, and it was never determined who wrote the message or if it had any connection to her case. A search was performed of an area alongside Interstate 15, about 3 miles east of Barstow, but nothing was found. Since April didn't have a cell phone, she often called Gloria collect from a number of different places she had stayed during her time in San Bernardino County, so Gloria was able to use phone records to call these numbers back and speak to people about April. One key piece of information that she learned was that Chuck Hollister was friends with an eccentric Vietnam veteran named Dan Dansbury, who went by the nickname Dan Dan, and they both had an interest in mines in the Mojave Desert, where they would collect materials in order to make jewelry. 2 decades earlier, Dan Dan had claimed an abandoned mine called the Red Dog Mine, which had been used during the California gold rush in the mid-19th century and was located near the unincorporated community of Ludlow, just over 30 miles east of Newberry Springs. Dan Dan was known for spending a lot of time hanging out in the desert at the Red Dog Mine and had left some cryptic messages on the walls of some nearby shacks, which included, quote, 3 people will keep a secret if 2 are dead, and, quote, you can leave or you can disappear. I can help you disappear. No problem, end quote. Investigators from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department initially had a hard time getting a hold of Dan Dan, but when they finally questioned him about April's disappearance, he confirmed that he knew her, but denied having any knowledge of what happened to her. Regardless, in December of 2004, a search was performed of the Red Dog Mine, which was about 200 feet deep, and they wound up discovering a message that Dan Dan had scrawled on the wall near the bottom when he first claimed the mine, as it read, quote, Dan Dan, 1979. But in the end, they were unable to turn up April or any evidence that she had been inside the mine. In January of 2005, investigators were contacted by Andrea Pruitt, the owner of the Baghdad Cafe, an establishment located in Newberry Springs on U.S. Route 66. Andrea recognized April's photo from a missing persons poster and claimed that she had hired her as a part-time waitress in June of 2004, not long before she went missing, but on her second shift there, April showed up to work with what appeared to be a blackened eye and seemed quite upset. After that, April did not show up for any more shifts at the cafe, and Andrea never saw her again. While it was never determined who gave April the black eye, the Baghdad Cafe was located only a few blocks away from Chuck Hollister's residence on Caspian Way, where April was believed to have been staying at that time. Investigators asked a local historian, who was known for giving tours through the Mojave Desert and the abandoned mines, to keep an eye out for any potential evidence which might be connected to April's case. Well, sure enough, in December of 2005, he got in touch with the authorities to inform them that while giving a tour, he wound up discovering some women's clothing inside an abandoned shack next to a mine called the Indian Queen Mine, which was also located in Ludlow. Gloria was asked to make the trip from Arkansas to California in order to look at the clothing, and after she arrived at the Indian Queen Mine, she performed a search of the surrounding area and wound up discovering additional articles of clothing. One of these articles happened to be a flannel shirt, which Gloria had previously mailed to her daughter in a care package while she was struggling in San Bernardino County, so Gloria positively identified the shirt as belonging to April. A search of the Indian Queen Mine turned up no trace of April, but Gloria wanted to take a trip to the Red Dog Mine, which was located several miles away. When she arrived, Gloria was surprised to discover an empty white suitcase there, which had not been found during the previous search of the area 1 year earlier. In addition, additional garments of clothing, including a black lace bra that April often wore, were found scattered nearby, as well as a mattress and a sheet stained in human blood and bodily fluids. Unfortunately, since all of these items had been exposed to extremely hot and cold weather for a prolonged period of time, they did not have much evidentiary value. Gloria was certain that the white suitcase belonged to April, which struck everyone as odd, since Chuck specifically told her that April left her white suitcase at his residence when she disappeared. Over the next several years, Gloria would return to San Bernardino County to participate in numerous search efforts for April, and a lot of abandoned mines were checked. Gloria also became friends with Stephanie Thompson, whose 44-year-old mother, Kathy Leake, had lived a transient lifestyle as a sex worker who often frequented truck stops before she went missing from Barstow in November of 2003. Stephanie got in touch with Gloria after hearing a rumor that Kathy had been murdered and had her body dumped in Newberry Springs, leading her to wonder if her mother's case might be connected to April's disappearance. In fact, it was alleged that April once met Kathy in the unincorporated town of Yermo at the home of a woman whom Kathy had been staying with. In March of 2008, a skull and some additional remains were found by hikers near a mining road on the eastern border of Death Valley National Park in Inyo County, and nearly 2 years later, in November of 2009, DNA testing positively identified the bones as belonging to Kathy. It was later announced that Kathy's death was being investigated as a potential homicide, but it has never been solved, and since there is a limited amount of information available about Kathy's case, it's unclear if it might be connected to April's. In September of 2006, Chuck Hollister died of cancer at the age of 54, and while he was on his deathbed, he was visited by Detective Steve Pennington of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department's Homicide Unit, who was the lead investigator on April's case. Pennington urged Chuck to come clean and not take any secrets he may have had about April to his grave, but Chuck continued to deny having any knowledge or involvement in her disappearance before he passed away. Chuck's daughter later found a photo in his belongings which featured Chuck and his friend Dan standing near what appeared to be a different mine than the Red Dog Mine. Investigators were eventually able to identify it as another mine near Ludlow called the Golden Mine and performed a search of it, but while they found no evidence related to April's case, they did uncover a pile of rocks with a cross on it inside the mine, as well as a roach clip containing Chuck's initials. In 2009, Gloria took the initiative to try and speak with Dan, but after showing up at his residence, she was informed by a neighbor that Dan was seriously ill and in the intensive care unit of a local hospital. When Gloria paid a visit to the hospital, one of the nurses mistakenly assumed that she was a member of Dan's family and asked Gloria to feed him his lunch. While doing this, Gloria took the opportunity to question Dan about April and found him to be a surprisingly kind and open person. They spoke for over an hour, and while Dan denied any involvement in April's disappearance, he broke down crying and told Gloria that April was a sweetheart and said that whoever killed her deserved to be brought to justice. Dan passed away a short time later, but while he never confessed anything to Gloria, he supposedly told other people that he knew more about April's disappearance than he let on. An older woman whom Dan was close to also contacted investigators and recounted an incident where Dan became upset after a search was conducted of one of the mines for April's remains. Nothing had been found, and this prompted Dan to admit to having killed April before he said, quote, "They're in the right place, they didn't go far enough," end quote. Based on this new information, another search was performed of some mines in the Ludlow area, including the Red Dog mine, but while the local media reported that a suspect and another person of interest had since died, their names were not released publicly at that time. Detective Pennington stated, quote, "Since both are now deceased, the searches are about recovering her body. There is no one for us to prosecute at this point," end quote. Even though a concerted effort was made to delve as deep as possible into the Red Dog mine, it once again failed to turn up any trace of April, and investigators became convinced that her remains were not in there. In November of 2010, April's case would be featured on an episode of the true crime TV series Disappeared, which was titled Mojave Mystery, and actually named Chuck Hollister and Dan Dansbury as potential suspects in April's disappearance. In August of 2012, after having been missing for over 8 years, April was finally declared legally dead. In July of 2013, Gloria gave an interview for the Barstow-based newspaper The Desert Dispatch, in which she revealed that she had been able to travel to California to participate in any further search efforts since she was recovering from back surgery. She also claimed that a private investigator she had hired had recently died of complications during ear surgery and never got the chance to interview a potentially key person of interest after a previous article published in the Desert Dispatch asked anyone to come forward with new information. This led to the private investigator being told that April had attended a party in Newberry Springs on the day she went missing. The story was that there were around 7 to 9 other people in attendance at the party, and April may have been filmed on videotape, but no copies of this tape were ever uncovered, and this angle pretty much hit a dead end when the private investigator passed away. Gloria did finally return to Barstow in September of that year, where a memorial service was held at a local funeral home, and a plaque for April was hung on a memorial wall at the cemetery, Mountain View Memorial Park. The last thing we need to talk about is Steve Wilkinson, who portrayed himself as a reformed criminal and a friend to April during his interview on the Disappeared episode. He also claimed that he last saw April when he dropped her off at Chuck Hollister's residence on June the 23rd, 2004, 5 days before she disappeared. Well, it turned out that Wilkinson was pretty much the biggest methamphetamine manufacturer in San Bernardino County, as on September the 1st, 2015, he was arrested on a number of different drug charges. Wilkinson was subsequently released on a $50,000 bond, and 3 days later, on September the 4th, he and 3 other people boarded a Cessna 310 airplane in Daggett, which was scheduled to fly to Amarillo, Texas. They stopped to refuel in Flagstaff, Arizona, but after the plane took back off again and resumed its flight, it wound up crashing into a mountain near Silverton, Colorado, killing everyone on board. It's been reported that the pilot, who happened to be Wilkinson's father-in-law, was not licensed to fly the aircraft, but there have also been rumors that Wilkinson was not actually on board when it crashed and faked his own death, but I'll address that topic again later on. During her Unfound interview, Gloria reported that Wilkinson had supposedly been seen near the Red Dog mine on the day before his fatal flight, and while she believes that April's remains may have been in there at some point, she suspects they were moved elsewhere. But after 2 decades, April Pitzer continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So this is one of the more heartbreaking stories ever featured on Disappeared, because April Pitzer was a woman who could have conceivably lived a happy life with her husband and children, but wound up going into such a downward spiral that she wound up homeless in a very sketchy desert community in California. During the last few months of her life, it sounds like April was finally getting things together and was ready for a fresh start with her mother, but before this could happen, she wound up vanishing without a trace and likely became the victim of foul play. I know that April's mother, Gloria Denton, has always felt that the big turning point which led to her downward spiral was when she was forced to testify as an informant for the DEA during a major federal case in which over 30 people from a drug ring went to prison. This supposedly changed April's entire personality and caused her to become incredibly paranoid that her life was in danger, and when you combine this with the allegations that she was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder and prescribed medication she shouldn't have been taking, this pretty much destroyed her family life and caused her to start hanging out with the wrong crowd. I've always found it incredibly odd that April wound up becoming an undercover drug informant after being arrested on a DUI, as the narrative which has always been pushed forward is that April was pulled over after giving a ride to a pair of strangers she met at a bar who just happened to be carrying methamphetamine at that time. While I can understand April wanting to cooperate with law enforcement to avoid jail time and having a criminal record, it still seems bizarre that she would be recruited to be a drug informant rather than, the people who had drugs on them. I've always wondered if there was more to this story, and just under 9 years ago, the YouTube channel Explore With Us produced a video about this case in which the host did a criminal record check under April's maiden name, April Beth Coggins. He wound up finding records for a woman with that name and April's exact birth date, February the 19th, 1974, and it turned out she had been arrested on 2 separate occasions in 1997 in 2 separate counties in Arkansas on forgery charges. Since forgery is a Class C felony, which carries a potential sentence of 3 to 10 years in prison, it seems more likely that April might agree to become an informant if she was arrested on these charges rather than a DUI. Now, the DUI took place 3 years before this in 1994, but since the federal drug trial occurred in 1998, I have to wonder if the DEA held these forgery charges over April's head in order to pressure her into testifying, even though she was 8 months pregnant at that time. However, even if April did make a number of mistakes in her personal life, which put her in this situation, that obviously doesn't mean she deserved to go missing or get murdered. The big unanswered question in this case is whether April's testimony at this trial was serious enough for someone to have killed her in an entirely different state 6 years later. The big reason this theory has been presented is because April just happened to have an encounter with a woman named Brandy Brooks, the wife of a man whom April helped sent to prison for 7 years because of her testimony. It definitely seems like too much of a coincidence that April would go missing just a few days after this encounter took place, but it's also quite a coincidence that April even crossed paths with this woman to begin with, as the trial took place in Arkansas and April bumped into her in a small California town in the Mojave Desert. This occurred at a party being held by Steve Wilkinson, and when Wilkinson was interviewed on Disappeared, he even said, quote, "What are the odds that something like this would happen?" Wilkinson also claimed that when April attempted to apologize to Brooks, she openly revealed way too much information about her past as a drug informant, and a number of people who were at the party likely heard this. So even if Brooks herself didn't decide to make April disappear out of revenge, there were a number of people there who likely were involved in their own illegal activity and may have become paranoid that April would rat on them, so they had to ensure that she didn't leave the area alive. Well, at the time that Disappeared episode originally aired, I don't think many people realized that Wilkinson may have been telling on himself, since it turned out he was pretty much the biggest drug kingpin in that area. I previously made mention of an extensive interview that Gloria did on the Unfound podcast in 2017, where she alleged that the producers of Disappeared did not show her the final cut of the episode before it aired on television, so she was quite surprised to see interviews with at least 2 key people in this case who misrepresented themselves and seemed to be attempting to present their own narrative. Of course, one of them was Steve Wilkinson, and the other was John Lopez, the individual who convinced April to relocate to California to begin with. John made it sound like he and April had become involved in a relationship, and that when they arrived in Barstow, he tried to act as her protector and advised her to be careful because there were a number of sketchy and dangerous characters in the area. But according to Gloria, John was married at the time and a con artist with a criminal history of his own, and he was the one who introduced April to a number of these sketchy characters to begin with, before he abandoned her and stranded her in the area with no transportation to return home. No one has ever accused John of being directly involved in April's disappearance, but I know there has been speculation that he could have lured April to this area for nefarious reasons. So obviously, the biggest obstacle to conclusively solving this case is that many of the people who might know the truth about what happened to April are no longer with us, including Wilkinson, Chuck, and Dan. Gloria said that the deaths of these individuals have made people more willing to come forward and share information about what may have happened to April, but the issue is that it's often been hard to distinguish between fact and fiction. Over the years, Gloria has spoken to a number of people who lived in Newberry Springs, Barstow, and some of the surrounding communities during that time period, but while it sounds like she has gotten some pieces to the puzzle, it's difficult to put them all together. The Unfound podcast episode is nearly 2 hours long, and Gloria shared a lot of wild stories she had heard about things that supposedly happened to April during her 6-month stay in the area, including her supposedly getting shot in the leg by Dan at one point. But since Gloria did not witness these events firsthand, it's hard to know how many of them are true, particularly since so many of the local residents are not exactly trustworthy witnesses, and some of their stories are a bit confusing. I previously made mention of how Gloria befriended the daughter of a woman named Kathy Leake, who vanished from Barstow around the same time that April arrived in the area, and they even may have met at some point. Other than the fact that Kathy's remains were found in Death Valley National Park years later, and she was likely the victim of a homicide, there's very little information available about her case, though I have seen some advocacy organizations spreading awareness about it on social media in recent years. While there is nothing to suggest that Kathy's murder and April's disappearance are connected, I think this just demonstrates what a dangerous place that section of San Bernardino County was at that time, and unfortunately, since it is surrounded by nothing but desert and abandoned mines, there is no shortage of places where April's remains might be. So let's look at the actual circumstances of how April went missing. Most sources list the date of April's disappearance as June the 28th, 2004, because that's when Chuck Hollister claimed that he last saw her, though he supposedly shared many different versions of what happened. The version which has been shared by most sources, including the disappeared episode, is that Chuck last saw April when he left his house on the morning of June the 28th, and when he returned later that day, she was gone. However, I noticed that April's profile page at the State of California Department of Justice Office of the Attorney General website lists April's disappearance date as June the 26th. This may be due to potential credibility issues with Chuck, as it sounds like June the 26th might be the last official sighting from a credible independent eyewitness, as Barbara Killebrew, the elderly invalid April had been caring for, claimed that Chuck brought April by her residence to pick up her belongings on the 26th and say goodbye to her since she was planning to return home to Arkansas. But since April couldn't afford the cost of a bus ticket, she was going to contact Gloria and ask her to wire her the money for it when she was ready to make the trip. Since this obviously never occurred, this indicates that something happened to April and she did not leave the area of her own accord. I know that a private investigator hired by Gloria later informed her about a rumor that April had been seen at a party on the day she went missing, which was attended by 7 to 9 people, and there was apparently videotape footage of April there. I don't believe this rumor was ever corroborated, but if April did attend a party sometime between June the 26th and the 28th, this could be where something bad happened to her. One of the biggest red flags in Chuck's story is he told Gloria that when he returned home on the 28th and discovered that April was gone, he just assumed that she had left on her trip to Arkansas, even though she left a number of personal belongings behind, including her backpack and white suitcase. That's troubling enough, but a year and a half later, this white suitcase suddenly turned up in the Mojave Desert outside the Red Dog Mine, even though the area had already been searched on a prior occasion and the suitcase was not there. And it suddenly showed up, not long after some of April's clothing was found near the Indian Queen mine, which was several miles away. The Red Dog mine has been searched so thoroughly that investigators became pretty confident that April's remains were not in there, though Gloria has not discounted the possibility that they were inside the mine at some point before they were moved to a different location. So it does seem like the appearance of the suitcase at the Red Dog mine may have been an attempt to mislead the investigation and send the authorities in the wrong direction. According to Gloria, even though Chuck originally told her that he assumed that April had left his residence to travel back to Arkansas, he apparently told a police officer a different story about how he thought April had gone to stay with Steve Wilkinson for a few days. He also would not let the police search his property, which might explain why April's suitcase was never taken as evidence. Chuck even changed his phone number, so after their initial conversation, Gloria was unable to speak with them again. But we know that Chuck did tell Gloria that April left her suitcase with him, so how did it wind up in the desert unless he played a role in planting it there? One of the biggest obstacles to figuring out the truth about what happened to April is that this area was filled with sketchy, unreliable eyewitnesses, but it sounds like two of the most decent and helpful residents were Barbara Killebrew and Andrea Pruitt, who briefly hired April as a waitress at the Baghdad Cafe in June of 2004. She claimed that April only worked 2 shifts there, and after showing up for her second shift with what appeared to be a black eye, she never came back. To this day, we still don't know who gave April this black eye, and sadly, there are no shortage of candidates in the area who could have done it. I wish we had specific dates for when this happened, but since Andrea did not come forward until 6 months after the fact, I don't think she could recall them. From what I gathered, April had been staying with Steve Wilkinson, but after attending his party on June the 22nd and having her encounter with Brandy Brooks, April told Gloria that she was going to stay with Chuck until she wired her money for a bus ticket, and Chuck's residence was located only a few blocks away from the Baghdad Cafe. I have no idea if April worked her shifts at the cafe before or after the 22nd, though the disappeared episode pushed forward the idea that her final shift could have been the same day that she disappeared. I'm inclined to think this would have been before the 22nd, since I see no reason for April to get a job there if she was planning to leave the area. But if April received her black eye while living with Wilkinson and he was the culprit, then this once again points to him potentially being involved in her disappearance, even though he tried to portray himself as a supportive friend during his interview on Disappeared. On the surface, Chuck Hollister sounded like he might be one of the more decent residents of the area, since he was known for helping people who were down on their luck, and April even referred to him as Uncle Chuck and seemed to think she would be safe if she stayed with him before she went to Arkansas. But I already pointed out the troubling holes in Chuck's story, which make it impossible for me to believe that he wasn't involved in April's disappearance, or at the very least, knew more than he was letting on. I know that Gloria was unable to reach Chuck on the phone for weeks after April went missing, as he claimed he traveled to Oregon to help a friend move there, though it's unclear how thoroughly law enforcement verified his whereabouts during this time period. The Oregon connection is particularly interesting when you consider that cryptic graffiti, which may or may not have been connected to April's case, was found scrawled on the wall of a truck stop washroom in Roseburg, Oregon, and it read, quote, "Want to find a missing girl from Arkansas, I-15, 3 miles east of Barstow," end quote. I know there's been speculation that Chuck could have written this, but the issue is that it was discovered by an employee in September of 2004, 2 months after Chuck made his trip to Oregon, and since this washroom was cleaned several times per day, I seriously doubt that graffiti would have gone unnoticed that entire time. Law enforcement checked the surveillance footage from that time period, which showed everyone entering and exiting the washroom, but they were unable to pick out anyone who may have had a personal connection to April. We technically can't even be 100% certain if the graffiti is connected to April's case, and even if it was, it may have just been written by someone who read about her disappearance in the newspaper or something and decided to perform a prank for their own personal amusement. So Chuck died of cancer only 2 years after April went missing, and even while he was on his deathbed, he continued to deny any involvement. Of course, the alternate possibility is that even if Chuck did not personally do anything to April, perhaps he was protecting his best friend Dan, who was still alive at that point, until he passed away a few years later. During interviews, Gloria has openly stated that she believes Dan killed April, though she definitely thinks that others were involved. What's interesting is that when Gloria snuck into Dan's hospital room and questioned him about April's case when he was seriously ill, she described him as being surprisingly kind and compassionate, as he spoke with her about April for over an hour and said nice things about her, even though he never admitted any culpability in her disappearance. During her Unfound interview, Gloria claimed that the main reason that Dan got his nickname was because he supposedly had multiple personality disorder, so when she spoke with him at the hospital, she may have been seeing his quote-unquote good personality, even though he had a much darker one, which may have been capable of committing murder. Indeed, Dan allegedly admitted to another person that he killed Gloria, and that even though the search effort for her was in the right place, they quote-unquote didn't go far enough. It's hard to tell if he was specifically inferring that April's remains were in one of the abandoned mine shafts that was searched, but they didn't go deep enough, or if she might have been in one of the areas they searched, and they just missed the exact location. Since Chuck was already deceased by the time April spoke with Dan, he would have no reason to protect him, but Steve Wilkinson was still alive at that point, so if he was involved, perhaps Dan was trying not to incriminate him. There are just so many suspicious characters in this story, but one individual who doesn't get mentioned that much is Brandy Brooks. All we know is that April bumped into her at a party, and she supposedly apologized to Brandy for helping put her husband in prison, but we have no idea what happened to Brandy afterward. Was she still in San Bernardino County by the time April went missing days later? How thoroughly was she investigated by law enforcement? Unfortunately, they haven't said too much about her, but there's been speculation that it's no coincidence that she happened to show up at that party, as April may have been the victim of an elaborate setup. In online discussions about this case, you'll see the DEA receive heavy criticism for not offering better protection for April after she testified as an informant for them, but the issue is that she did not go missing until 6 years after the trial, and it's not like they could keep her under surveillance for that long. I suppose they could have put April in witness protection, but I'm not sure if that would have been a viable option for her, as she was 8 months pregnant, and her husband at the time, April Pitzer, was part of a wealthy family who had roots in Fort Worth, Texas, so if April had elected to change her identity and move to another location, I have my doubts that Chase would have gone along with it, and April never would have had custody of her children. And while it's been speculated that John Lopez could have intentionally lured April to California as part of a revenge scheme for her testimony, she lived there for 6 months before she disappeared. It just seems most likely to me that those sketchy characters in San Bernardino County knew nothing about April's past as a drug informant, but when this information came out following her encounter with Brandy Brooks, someone decided that she was a liability. Unfortunately, since April was missing for weeks before the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department launched an official investigation, the responsible party had plenty of time to cover their tracks, and there's no shortage of places to dispose of a murder victim in the Mojave Desert. It's been reported that after Steve Wilkinson was released on bond following his arrest on the drug charges in September of 2015, he was seen in the vicinity of the Red Dog Mine, so one theory is that he moved April's remains somewhere before he was killed during the plane crash. And of course, some conspiracy theorists have pushed forward the idea that Wilkinson was not even on the plane when it crashed, as they did not actually perform DNA testing on the bodies found in the wreckage. So theoretically, if Wilkinson got off the plane when it stopped to refuel in Flagstaff, and someone else climbed on board before it crashed in Silverton, perhaps he successfully faked his own death. Gloria discussed this possibility on the Unfound episode, which came out in 2017, just 2 years after the crash, but here we are in 2026, and as far as I can tell, no compelling evidence has ever surfaced to suggest that Steve Wilkinson is still alive. I can definitely see why this crash looks sketchy, as the plane was supposed to be heading to Amarillo, Texas, but Silverton, Colorado is way off course, so I have no idea why they were heading in that direction in the first place. But since the pilot of this plane was not licensed, I think the most logical explanation is that he may have simply gone in the wrong direction before he accidentally crashed into a mountain, killing everyone on board, including Wilkinson. But even though he doesn't sound like an individual who would be greatly missed, Wilkinson's death was still bittersweet, because it sounds like he was one of numerous individuals who had knowledge about what happened to April and took that secret to their graves. With all the information we have now, it's very hard for me to formulate a concrete theory about what happened because we have so many different potential suspects, but while their level of involvement is up for debate, I have a hard time believing that Chuck Hollister and Dan Dansbury were completely innocent in this affair, because at the very least, they probably knew more than they were letting on and would not reveal the full truth, even when they were both on their deathbeds. It sounds like most of the public suspicion directed towards Steve Wilkinson did not occur until after his death, but it's also not implausible that he had knowledge or involvement with what happened to April, though whether he killed her himself or got someone else to do it remains unclear. Law enforcement has been very open about the fact that prosecuting the individuals responsible for April's disappearance is no longer a top priority since many of the key players are deceased, but they would still like to recover April's remains and give her a proper burial. For many years, Gloria Denton was a tireless advocate for April as she traveled to California and participated in several search efforts for her daughter, but it sounds like she was hampered by a back injury and has been a lot quieter in recent years. I have no idea if law enforcement is still actively searching for April, but the issue is that when you're talking about many miles of open desert and thousands of abandoned mines, looking for her is like trying to find a needle in the proverbial haystack. However, even though the responsible parties may be deceased, there have been so many rumors spread about April's disappearance that I have to think that there are still people out there who know the full truth about what happened to April, and it could help pave the way to the recovery of her remains if they come forward. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of April Pitzer, please contact the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department at 760-256-4838. That's 760-256-4838. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 8 years, our Patreon page has officially released 100 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released another episode with one of my Unsolved Mysteries themed top 10 countdown lists, the top 10 most suspicious interviews on Unsolved Mysteries, where I discuss some of the show's most infamous examples of a potential suspect in a cold case agreeing to appear on camera to defend themselves during an interview. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a case from Unsolved Mysteries involving a suspicious suicide, the 1986 death of Ray Ann Mosser. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 90 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Katie L., Michelle C., and Nikki. Thank you so much for your support. I also wanted to mention that from September the 11th to the 13th, for the second consecutive year, I will be attending AdvocacyCon, a true crime conference being held for victims' families at the Albuquerque Convention Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. If you would like to purchase tickets, you can use a specialized promo code in order to get 10% off. So please visit advocacycon.com and enter the promo code TRAILCOLD10 for 10% off tickets. That's advocacycon.com, and the promo code is TRAILCOLD10. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.
Thank you.